Hello, Valley Church. My name is Darren, and I have a question for you. Anyone out there like riddles? Because I have one for you. Here we go. What has 4 legs and a body, but can't walk? A table. Okay, yeah, that was too easy. Let me give you one that's a little tougher. I am something, I am endless as chain. Once you have me, you are bound for life. But young people want me. What am I? The answer? A wedding ring. Well, speaking of wedding rings, our passage today is matrimonial in nature, and also it provides a riddle of sorts for us to solve. What we're going to do this morning is watch Jesus drop mysterious hints about his true nature. He's been doing that over the last couple of chapters as we've explored this portion of Matthew, and he's going to continue to do so today in this just terrific story. Here it is. One day, the followers of John the Baptist visit Jesus puzzled, and they find Jesus to just be one gigantic walking riddle. In verse 14 of chapter 9, Matthew tells us that then the disciples of John came to him saying, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" Well, remember what Pastor Kurt taught us last Sunday, that Jesus hobnobbed with the spiritual deplorables of his day. Like, for example, the author of the book that we're studying, Matthew, and Matthew's friends. And notice this key word, then, the first word, which ties this story back to the story that Kurt taught us last Sunday. So I picture that John's men pull Jesus out of Matthew's banquet because for them, this question is just too pressing. Well, first, regarding the issue of fasting in the first century, it was a common practice for Jews in Jesus' day, although only one fast was required, and that was the fast to be honored on the Day of Atonement. However, during Jesus' day, strict Jews often went hungry, not just on the Day of Atonement, but on Monday and on Thursday, and often on other days as well. Now, expressions of sorrow did make some sense. They were oppressed by foreign enemies. They had no king in the line of David. And in a sense, this might surprise you, but they had no God with them. He had been absent, so to speak, since his glory fled the temple 500 years before, when the people's idolatry and rebellion drove God away and drew in their enemies, the Babylonians. So fasting made some sense. That's what you do when you're in a sorrowful condition. And just like many of the Pharisees, the disciples of John also fasted, doing, again, what was appropriate for devout Jews to do who were lamenting the absence of Yahweh, of God in their midst. So imagine at the front door of Matthew's party, John's men pull Jesus out, and they say, "We and the Pharisees go sad and empty," which is obviously fitting for our Messiah-less, God-abandoned, foreign-occupied circumstances. But your disciples don't. They act as if the age to come has already come. Well, tell you what, let's back up a little more and just understand this episode in the context of the big biblical story. And if you got your notes, if you printed them, you'll see this colorful chart, which is called Tortured and Triumphant Love, how Yahweh came, left, returned and transformed his people. This is the big story. And this passage that we're studying from Matthew 9 will make a lot more sense if we understand it as one scene in one chapter in this larger book that tells the true story of reality. So if you have the notes, what you see in front of you is an 8-chapter summary of this divine human love story, which now stretches out over 30 centuries and is still being written today. So, okay, chapter 1 of tortured and triumphant love. This chapter is called Tender Beginning, and it stretches from 1500 to 900 BCE. That's 3,500 years ago. God delivered his people from Egypt. He made a covenant with them at Mount Sinai. And at this covenant ceremony, the people promised to love and obey him, saying, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And despite ups and downs, God dwells with his people in the desert, just like a betrothed and caring, attentive groom. And then the apex, the high point of this first chapter is in 900 BC when the glory of God floods into the temple that King Solomon built, picturing God dwelling with his people. Well, how about chapter 2? This one's not so rosy. This one's called Betrayal and Pain, from 899 to 600 BCE. See, God's beloved people spiral downward into idolatry and immorality. And the prophets, including the prophet Isaiah, predicts the nation's downfall and exile from their land if they don't return to their first love. He says, you can't continue this way. But Isaiah also predicts in matrimonial language, which is so key, that love will be rekindled and covenant will be reconstituted after inevitable destruction. Isaiah 62:4, this is looking hundreds of years into the future. The prophet says, you shall no more be termed forsaken or like abandoned. As the bridegroom rejoices over the bride, oh, catch that language, so shall your God rejoice over you. How about chapter 3? Divorce and Devastation is what this one is called. This is 2,600 years ago. The worst happens. Yahweh abandons the temple, and the Babylonians burn and destroy both city and temple, deporting the chronically rebellious, covenant-breaking people of God. And Jeremiah, who's called the weeping prophet for good reason, writes about Nebuchadnezzar leveling the city and God's special dwelling place, the temple. And in one of the most dismal chapters of the Bible, Jeremiah chapter 52, verse 13 might be the most bitter of all, because the prophet says, and he, referring to Nebuchadnezzar, burned the house of the Lord. But that's not the end of this love story, as tortured as it is. Chapter 4 follows, and it's this: long road back, 539 to 439 BCE, 2,500 years ago. God moves the Persian king to let the exiles return and rebuild the temple. It's a smaller version, but they're back in their land, but things aren't right. They're still oppressed by outsiders, and they sense Yahweh's distance, and they have proof because, they're dominated by outsiders. Well, no specific verse here, but this theme of Yahweh's absence, it runs through many of the prophets and even other Jewish books that were written during this period, books that in a period that scholars call the Second Temple period. So, but again, there's more to the story. Chapter 5. This is called aching and fasting from 400 to BCE, 400 BCE to 29 CE, Common Era. We're getting closer to the time of Christ. During this time of deafening divine quiet, right up to the birth of Christ, the promise of Yahweh's dramatic return in Isaiah, it goes unfulfilled, despite an additional word of promise from Malachi chapter 3, verse 1. And the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. Okay, this is the place where the disciples of John in the story we're reading, they thought they were. They thought that they were in chapter 5, this aching and fasting due to the absence of Yahweh. They were saying, we're waiting, and the prophets promised, but he hasn't come back yet. And circumstances prove that. Yes, we're back from exile in Babylon, and yes, we've rebuilt the temple, but there's no divine heaviness, no glory sensing him in our midst. Their condition was, in their view, lo Emmanuel, God not with us. And again, the Roman soldiers on every street corner were proof positive of their view. So we can understand why they thought displays of sorrow made perfect sense, if indeed they were still in chapter 5. But maybe they were wrong. Maybe John's men were on the wrong page. They were in the wrong chapter of the story. Because here's chapter 6, a surprise return and re-betrothal. 30 to 33, Common Era. Again, when Jesus came on the scene, he didn't fast, except for one time before his temptation, and neither did his disciples. But rather, he and they ate and drank enthusiastically with all kinds of disreputable people, earning him the reputation as a glutton and a drunkard. So Jesus didn't do what they thought was proper and appropriate for life in chapter 5, acting and fasting. It was like Jesus was crashing this national funeral, turning it into a party with his healings and his deliverances. He just wasn't in step with the times in their view. And today, he would be called out on social media for being tone deaf. Don't you know, Jesus? We're under the thumbs of the Romans. We're not free. We don't have a king like David sitting on the throne. And most of all, Yahweh, our God, is absent. He's at a distance. But Jesus is going to challenge their presupposition, their erroneous understanding of the time, of their erroneous idea of their place in the story with this marriage-themed question. That's absolutely no accident. He's going to say with a twinkle in his royal eye, you have to turn the page. We are in a new chapter because Jesus knew, and we know, that they were actually in chapter 6, a surprise return and betrothal, despite some of the appearances to the contrary. But Jesus doesn't come right out and say it that way. He communicates artfully and indirectly. Okay, now back to our particular story in Matthew 9. Since we know now kind of the big plot panorama, this next verse I think will really pop off the page for you. Matthew 9, 15a. And Jesus said to them, can the wedding guests mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? This question is meant to elicit a negative answer. Hey, no way, not a chance. And just a little story here. When we went a couple years ago to Ariana Jones's wedding, the focus, of course, was on the beautiful and godly bride, Ariana. And Jared Lacey, her groom, was honestly somewhat of an afterthought. In fact, for our purposes, he was easily exchangeable with any number of other young men who were at this wedding because it was all about her. But in ancient Jewish weddings, the groom was the center of attention. He was the centerpiece, and he was the joy-determining persona for the wedding guests. See, when the groom was present, sorrow was impossible. And every good Jew knew that. But can you imagine their response? Jesus, these times aren't wedding-ish at all. Just look around. But then maybe some of them started to think, there is something unique about this guy. He's been lighting up the countryside with healings and exorcisms. And we've heard how he brought a deadly storm to a standstill. And everybody is talking about him with big smiles on their faces. And here's this party going on. And then maybe some of them remembered the Isaiah scroll that they had read since they were young. Chapter 54, verses 5-7. For your maker is your husband, your redeemer. For the Lord has called you like a wife deserted and grieved in spirit, like a wife of youth when she is cast off, says your God. For a brief moment I deserted you, but with great compassion I will gather you. Well, let's put this all together. The disciples of John were failing to recognize that Jesus is the long-promised, long-awaited messianic bridegroom. So Jesus is helping them to see what they can't quite see, that he himself, as surprising and mind-boggling though it is the fulfillment of Yahweh's promise to return to his people in love. Well, here's the big idea. It's the long-promised return of Yahweh. The bridegroom king is being accomplished through Jesus. And that's his point in speaking so cryptically. And again, with what I imagine is a big smile on his face. Let me say that again. God, embodied in Jesus, is beginning to restore, forgive, bring in the lost, the scattered, renewing Israel, and even, in a sense, expanding Israel. By bringing in the Gentiles like the prophets had promised, Jesus proves God's return as the bridegroom king. Jesus is saying, and it's cryptic, from the steps of Matthew's house party, this is what it looks like when God comes back in person to dwell with and rescue his people, just like the prophets said he would. And Matthew, in understanding this surprising, unexpected return of Yahweh, of God, in the person of Jesus, wrote right in the beginning of Matthew, showing that this theme is so important in Matthew, the return of Yahweh in the person of Jesus. He wrote, Matthew 1:23, behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. It's not God without us any longer. It's God with us once again. After so much sin-inflicted devastation that, in a sense, exiled him from us, he's back with mercy and compassion. And again, notice Jesus' very intentional imagery. It's that of a bridegroom. Well, as happy as that is, it's not quite the whole story, because this chapter is glorious, but it has a shadow side. Because Matthew 9:15b says this. Jesus says, the days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast. And this is key. See, chapter 6 is full of joy, but there's some painful aspects because reconciliation will demand the payment of an excruciating price. But this price will ultimately transform the hearts of God's wayward people. Here Jesus alludes cryptically to the crucifixion. See, to bring forgiveness of sins, he had to suffer and die and be raised to life and ascend to the Father's right hand. These are critical scenes in this story, told explicitly in Matthew 26 through 28. He had to be crushed by the sin of the entire deplorable human race. Our sin that brought separation, exile, and death. See, it might appear from his befriending of the masses that he might just be able to sweep the sin and rebellion and idolatry under the rug and in a sense say, let's let bygones be bygones. But no, he couldn't do that. Betrothal would demand that he himself take upon himself the disaster of their betrayal and unfaithfulness. And that's what Jesus did on the cross. But after 3 days in the tomb, he reappears and starts chapter 7 of this love story, the chapter we're in today, currently. And it's called Feasting, Fasting, and New Forms, from Pentecost to the present. And this is a really happy chapter. But again, we have to nuance it just a little bit because Jesus rose, the greatest event in human history, and then he ascended in his resurrection body to the Father's right hand where he presently reigns. So he's absent physically, but shortly after his ascension, he sent down his Spirit to be in us at all times. And now joy flows out of us and out of our transformed hearts. 1 Peter 1:8, though you do not see him now, you believe in him and rejoice with joy that is inexpressible. So, we mostly feast now, but we do have periods of fasting because he's not yet with us in his resurrected body. And we fast like we do on Wednesdays with Joel Moment because we're grieving the condition of the world as we represent him and we're helping others to know him too. So we don't just rejoice with joy inexpressible. We recognize that blessed are those who mourn. Okay, not quite done. We have 2 more verses and one last riddle. In verses 16 and 17, Jesus is going to talk about what's appropriate now. What's appropriate for his people in this 7th chapter when it comes to being faithful to this new marriage-like covenant, practicing it and spreading it to other people? Well, we know it's not constant fasting and long faces because the bridegroom is in us by his Spirit, and we, the church, are in him. But Jesus is going to take 2 examples from the daily lives of the poor that he grew up with to teach us how to proceed. Verse 16, no one puts a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch tears away from the garment and a worse tear is made. Now, this isn't in the text, but I like to picture that when Jesus taught this, he pointed to his own tattered cloak because he himself was poor. And his point is this: everyone knows you don't take a tattered, ragged garment and put a new patch on it because the patch is too unyielding, and the next time there's strain on that old garment, the new patch doesn't budge, but the old garment does, and you end up with a worse tear. So he's making a point about how old forms don't fit the new festive reality. Then, verse 17, he's going to continue with this theme and be more enigmatic to help us understand the point he's making here. He takes another example from everyday life of the poor in Judea. Verse 17, neither is new wine put into old wineskins. If it is, the skins burst and the wine is spilled and the skins are destroyed. But new wine is put into fresh wineskins, and so both are preserved. Again, he says, guys, you know this. People don't put wine that's still fermenting into old, crusty, stiff containers. See, wine back then was stored in bottles, you could call them, made from animal skins with openings to let out the gases from the still fermenting wine. So he says, hey, people don't put fresh wine into old skins because they aren't elastic. and they're not flexible. And when the new wine is put in, tough old wineskins, the gases expand as fermentation occurs, but the skins don't expand, and the skins burst, ruining the wine that you need to drink and that needs to be applied to wounds. That's another thing they did with wine back then. So if you have these inadequate carrying containers, the sweet wine never gets to the lips of the thirsty or to the wounds of the injured. And it's not the wine's fault. It's a wine carrier malfunction. So his second point is this: our teacher implies that his disciples will sew colorful, elastic carrying containers. We're going to carry the wine in festive and in diverse structures that really reflect this festive new reality of Emmanuel, of God with us. So, the last riddle-like aspect of this passage: what specifically, Jesus, are the new forms, these new carrying cases? And the answer is, he doesn't tell us specifically. He leaves us with somewhat of a riddle. And maybe he would have had he not been interrupted by a desperate man, whom we'll meet next week in the story. But Jesus doesn't decode this mystery for us. He doesn't give us a diagram for new wineskins, a set of directions. Use this fabric or this cutting pattern, measure here, stitch here. No, he doesn't do that. He gives some general instructions in different places in the gospel, but he doesn't specifically tell us how to carry that wine of the gospel to other people. So, with his Spirit, we'll have to figure out those new forms that best carry the wine of the gospel in our cultural context and in our time in history. And Christians have been doing this for 2,000 years. Jesus is saying, share the wine in a way that makes sense. Diverge from the predictable. Invent, innovate as you venture out to all the beautiful but broken ethnicities of the world. Look at the circumstances and the supplies at hand to make containers, to stitch strong, attractive wineskins. And that's where Jesus leaves us. That's where this scene in chapter 7 ends. Because sometimes we need to remember that our ways of representing the King, where once they were new and fresh, become tired and old, like cracked leather wineskins, and ill-suited for the ever-fresh and delicious wine. And so, like a dried-out, leaking leather bottle, the good news can drain out. Well, Jesus anticipated this, and so he said, cryptically, yes, but think about new methods, new strategies, new containers, new expressions of this new reality. And speaking of new realities, I want to share an opportunity with you. I'm going to tell you about Bayshore Christian Ministries. This is a group of Jesus followers located in the East Palo Alto area. And what they do is they equip youth in East Palo Alto to grow spiritually, to gain life skills, and to develop as leaders so that they can have a future and a hope. And on Sunday, October 25th, they're having a virtual fundraising and vision event that I'm going to attend called Hope and a Future. And I'm inviting you, Valley Church, to join me at this banquet. And there won't be any obligation whatsoever, but I want you to learn about this ministry with me and how they're equipping East of Bayshore youth for the future, and they're doing it in Jesus' name. And many of the young people whom they minister to are from deprived backgrounds where they haven't had the advantages that so many of us have had. So at this event, they're going to share stories of how even during COVID-19, Bayshore Christian ministry youth are becoming active Christ followers, and they're gaining hope and purpose and skills. And so I invite you to join with me in this banquet. You can sign up at bayshore.org. Just click on the banner that says virtual event on there. And when you register, be sure to mark me, Darren, as your host, and then we can participate in this together. And now I want to introduce my friend Larry Walters, who is going to share about how another group of modern disciples are taking Jesus' teaching to heart, and they're using new technological wineskins to carry the wine of the gospel. I know you'll enjoy Larry.
The gospel is always the same, but the way you preach it keeps on changing. I heard this quote from Tim Savoda, director of YWAM-SF, at the most recent Faith Tech meetup that I attended. I'll tell you a bit more about Faith Tech later, but I want to take a look at that statement. To me, it sounds very similar to what St. Paul said about becoming all things to all people in order to save them. And in order to do that, we have to embrace various forms of telling the good news. I admit this is not something I've been very good at. Reaching people from different backgrounds and cultures and even different industries requires a targeted approach based on the context. Now, historically, the church has embraced new forms of technology as they have been developed. Perhaps we haven't done this as well as we could have, but I think God has definitely led the church in this way. Let's take a look at just a few examples. Consider the Gutenberg Bible. What an amazing technology. I mean, with it, the church could rapidly manufacture and publish and disseminate the Bible and do it in mass quantities. Wonderful invention. And then what about airplanes? I mean, they've been used to take missionaries across the globe to peoples no one had even met before. The famous missionary Jim Elliot used an airplane to connect with the Auca Indians. And for 75 years or so, we've had the Mission Aviation Fellowship. Now, what about the ability to record audio and video? I mean, look at how much expertise and technical knowledge and experimentation went into creating records and tapes, CDs and DVDs, and all manner of forms of recording. I mean, the church has made pretty good use of this, I think, from recording on Sundays, just our sermons, to spreading the message of Jesus into TVs and radio and living room and the big screen across the world for decades. Particularly the Jesus film has been a highly effective evangelistic tool for years. And more recently, the internet and mobile devices have enabled instant access to all manner of spiritual content. This has facilitated what we could call digital missions, and it's being able to reach people that we never could before or would never step into a church building. For example, the Life Church, the makers of the Bible app, have given us the ability to read and hear the Bible in numerous languages just in the palm of our hand. And people daily use social media to tell their friends about the good news. So with all this technology, though, it didn't manifest overnight. I mean, although we have the Spirit of God, we don't have the creative, instantaneous power of God to just make things happen. We can't just speak and they come out of nothing. But rather, God uses time and talent and even people who reject him to develop technology that he's going to use for his good purposes. I recently heard a series of talks by Tony Reinke. He's a member of John Piper's Desiring God ministry. And in these talks, he opened my eyes to see in a new way how the Bible presents God not simply as the Lord of, but the Lord over technology. He's the Lord over all of it. My point is that Christians need to continue to push forward. They need to be aware of the technologies that are emerging around us so we can harness them for the gospel and the Great Commission, and also for facilitating the health of the church. And I think we have a tendency to think of technology as this secular thing and then a ministry as this sacred thing, but that's not really the case, and hopefully the examples I just gave show that. And I've encountered many people trying to spread this message that work, and particularly in technology, and our faith are really actually intimately connected. One such group in the Bay Area here is the Faith and Work Movement, and another is the Institute for Innovation, Integration, and Impact. So let's not be afraid of new mediums and technologies, even if they may sometimes be used for evil. In the hands of a madman, a knife can take a life, but in the hands of a surgeon, a knife can save a life. So remember that God is the greatest engineer. Why should the church languish behind industry if God is the Lord over technology? So just making it personal, in the past several years, I've had the privilege of being a part of several Christian hackathons. For those of you who may not be familiar with a hackathon, it's a short period of time, usually a weekend, where people get together and they think of ideas, they try to make something happen. The goal is to try to get something working by the end of the time. at least a proof of concept. And most hackathons are not spiritually oriented, but recently there's been several. And all over the world, people in tech and related disciplines are getting together near and far to put together new apps and websites and other products for the kingdom of God. And using that terminology, the first few of these I attended were run by a group called Code for the Kingdom, which I thought was really neat. Now this year I've started volunteering with a group called Faith Tech, the one I mentioned earlier, to organize a virtual hackathon. It's taking place next weekend, October 16th through 18th. And what I particularly like about Faith Tech as an organization is their initiative called Faith Tech Labs. The vision is to take a small number of selected projects, which have some real potential, and bring them through a structured process so that they can actually be released to the public or the ministry that they are targeted towards. For those of you who are in the tech world, you may be familiar with startup incubators. These are organizations that help startups get the momentum and the people and the resources and the funding to become a successful business. This is essentially that, but for tools that are going to build the kingdom of God and spread the gospel. I mean, how cool is that? This is what Silicon Valley is known for, and Faith Tech is taking that and adapting it for the kingdom. And the goal is to have this happening around the world, and indeed it already is happening. So Darren talked about old and new wine, old and new wineskins, and how we need to use the imaginations that God has given us to employ new styles and tools in reaching people near and far. And what I've shared is just a small taste of how that's happening around the world and here in the Bay Area. You know, God is going to use people from every sort of industry, from engineers to farmers to entrepreneurs to accountants, every area of industry, and the seemingly unspiritual tools that all these people are using every day, he's going to use them in ways we cannot imagine. So, in summary, just wrapping up, if anyone's interested in attending the hackathon next weekend, the info is in the church bulletin and in Darren's sermon notes, or you can go to www.hacksv.faith. And if you're interested in connecting with people in tech who have this kind of mindset that I've been describing, please let me know. I can definitely make introductions. Regardless of whether you get involved and attend, my point is applicable for all of us. Let's not miss the boat, but instead partake and share in the new wine.